All right, settle in, you magnificent historical voyeur. Grab your preferred comfort beverage, ideally something that pairs well with the slow, simmering dread of ancient power abuses. Because tonight, we're not embarking on some sun-drenched, heroic odyssey through the golden sands of Egypt. Oh no, we're going deeper. Past the gleaming gold masks, beyond the majestic temples, right into the sticky, morally ambiguous, often outright reprehensible underbelly of what it meant to be a living god. We're here for the messy, human, and frequently inhumane truth of pharaonic rule. Prepare for a grand tour of privilege, paranoia, and the truly spectacular ways one man, or occasionally woman, managed to screw over an entire civilization for millennia. Now, before we get too excited, a quick disclaimer. This isn't your average adrenaline-fueled ancient alien conspiracy theory. This isn't the history that makes you gasp in awe at architectural genius. This, my friends, is history as a sleep aid, a detailed, slightly monotonous descent into pharaonic shenanigans designed to lull you into a state of profound historical contemplation, or perhaps just a very deep, pharaoh-induced slumber. Try not to get too worked up. The screams of the exploited peasantry have long since faded, replaced by the gentle hum of your device and my dulcet, utterly sarcastic tones. If you find yourself drifting off, consider it a success. You're simply experiencing the historical equivalent of watching paint dry, only the paint is made of human ambition and pulverized hopes. So, let's up the tone, shall we? We're adopting a deeply cynical stance tonight. A jaded, eye-rolling perspective on power, privilege, and the absolute worst impulses of ancient rulers who genuinely believed they were hot stuff straight from the heavens. Imagine, if you will, the most insufferable tech mogul you've ever encountered, but with an army, an empire, and a direct line to the cosmic mainframe. We're not here to celebrate their ingenuity, but to mock their hubris, to dissect their moral failings, and to occasionally wonder if anyone ever just poked them with a stick and asked, "Are you sure about that, boss?" Because, spoiler alert, they were rarely, if ever, sure about anything beyond their own divine right to whatever they fancied. And what, precisely, constitutes sin when you are, by all accounts, a god walking among mere mortals? It's a rather fascinating, if deeply unsettling, philosophical pretzel, isn't it? If the rules of morality are divinely ordained, and you are part of that divinity, then who exactly is going to slap your wrist? The guy who feeds you grapes? The priest who bows so low his forehead scrapes the floor? When your every whim is a divine decree, and your bad mood can be interpreted as cosmic displeasure, the concept of sin becomes, shall we say, remarkably flexible. It's like having a universal get-out-of-jail-free card, only instead of jail, it's eternal damnation, and instead of free, it's because you are the guy who owns the game board. Ancient morality, you see, was often a game played by rules, designed by the players themselves, especially when those players wore crowns and claimed direct lineage from the sun. Our modern sensibilities, accustomed to things like human rights and not marrying your sister, might find this a touch problematic. But then, we're not gods, are we? Just tired observers. This whole spectacular denial of basic human decency was built upon a rather elegant, if utterly self-serving, worldview. The ancient Egyptians believed in Ma'at, the cosmic order, balance, truth, and justice. It was the fundamental principle that kept the universe from devolving into chaotic soup. And who was the chief guarantor of Ma'at on Earth? Why, the Pharaoh, of course. He was the divine intermediary, the living embodiment of cosmic harmony. His job was to maintain order, perform rituals, keep the gods happy, and ensure the Nile flooded on time. A rather tall order, you might think. But here's the rub. Every single pharaoh, from the earliest mud brick monarch to the last Ptolemaic queen, consistently bent, twisted, stretched, and occasionally outright shattered Ma'at to suit their own convenience. It was less about maintaining cosmic balance and more about maintaining their grip on power, their overflowing treasuries, and their perpetually expanding harems. Ma'at was a lovely theoretical construct, but when faced with a pharaoh's insatiable ego, it apparently had all the structural integrity of a damp papyrus scroll in a sandstorm. And so, our long, winding journey into pharaonic denial and divine right begins. Don't worry, there's plenty more where that came from. Before the pyramids, before the mummies wrapped in gold, before the utterly ubiquitous cat statues, there was mud, and a lot of very ambitious men with pointy sticks. Our story of pharaonic sin doesn't begin with grand palaces, but with the clatter of stone axes and the slow, grinding consolidation of power. Enter the very first pharaohs. Figures like Menes, or perhaps Narmer, depending on which archaeologist's fever dream you prefer. They weren't exactly building colossal vanity projects yet. Their sin was more primal, blunt force trauma, and the ruthless efficiency of unifying a disparate land. Imagine a bunch of squabbling toddlers, and then one really big, angry toddler takes all the toys. That was the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Less about grand vision, more about not wanting your neighbor to have better irrigation canals. This was the birth of the cult of personality, an ancient Egyptian reality show where the star never got voted off. How does a regular, flesh-and-blood human being convince everyone, including himself, that he's a living god? Propaganda, baby. It starts early. Before Photoshop, before TikTok, there was the Narmer palette, depicting our man Narmer clubbing his enemies into submission while wearing a fancy hat. It's subtle, really, just a little image management. Look, it says, this guy is so good at hitting people, he must be special, probably divine. Best not argue. This was the original brand identity. Pharaoh, accept no substitutes, now with 100% more divinity. The transition from strongman to deity was remarkably swift, fueled by a populace that likely preferred divine stability to constant tribal warfare. Or perhaps they just liked being told what to do, provided it came with promises of eternal sunshine and regular Nile floods. With this newfound divine status came the truly delightful early examples of pharaonic privilege. Because if you're a god, you don't just ask for things, you command them. And what did these early, relatively humble pharaohs command? Resources. Lots of resources. And labor. Even more labor. We're talking massive construction projects. Not yet pyramids, but monumental tombs and administrative centers, all relying on what we might charitably call unpaid labor, or, if we're feeling particularly cynical, forced community service with a very high mortality rate. No health and safety regulations here, folks. Just sweat, dust, and the occasional back-breaking collapse. The sin here is simple. Taking without asking, expecting without earning, and building a legacy on the backs of those who had no choice but to lift. It's the blueprint for every subsequent tyrant, just with slightly less elaborate headgear. And then came the royal burials, an early peek into the opulent preparations for an afterlife that put even the most extravagant modern funeral homes to shame. These aren't your grandma's modest headstones. These are entire subterranean complexes filled with goods for the journey to the duat. Gold, jewels, furniture, food, even entire boats. Because a god can't be expected to walk to the afterlife, can he? This wasn't just about sending off a beloved ruler. It was an economic black hole. The implicit sin here isn't just vanity. It's the massive drain on a nascent economy. Imagine emptying a nation's treasury into a hole in the ground just so one guy can have a decent, eternal paddleboard session. It's a level of self-indulgence that makes even today's billionaires blush. And this, remember, is just the beginning. We haven't even gotten to the truly absurd stuff yet. Oh, you sweet summer child. Welcome to the Old Kingdom, where the Pharaohs apparently discovered the fundamental truth of ego. The bigger the monument, the bigger the man. Or at least, that's what they desperately wanted you to believe. Our first star in this parade of monumental narcissism is Djoser, with his step pyramid at Saqqara. This wasn't just a tomb, it was the ultimate vanity project, a giant middle finger to mortality. You see, before Djoser, pharaohs got buried under mastabas, basically glorified mud brick benches. Djoser looked at those and thought, nah, that's not living God enough. So he stacked them, like giant Lego bricks, but with infinitely more sweat, tears, and crushed fingers. The question isn't how they built it, but how much one man's ego cost an entire kingdom. The answer? A truly astronomical amount of resources, labor, and collective societal anxiety. Behind every great pharaoh, there's often a truly brilliant, often equally exploited mind. In Djoser's case, that was Imhotep. The guy was a polymath, architect, physician, high priest, possibly even a magician. He's the ancient equivalent of Elon Musk, if Elon Musk also invented medicine and designed your tomb. Imhotep unwittingly enabled millennia of pharaonic overspending. He showed them what was possible. He unleashed the beast of monumental ambition. He essentially gave birth to the idea that if you had enough stone, enough muscle, and enough divine right, you could build anything. And the pharaohs, bless their cotton socks, took that ball and ran with it, straight into the national coffers. Imhotep was a genius, yes, but he also inadvertently signed the death warrant for Egyptian fiscal responsibility. A small sin of enablement, perhaps, but with enormous pyramid-sized consequences. Then we have Sneferu, often lauded as the good king. Good, they say. Well, define good. Because good, in pharaonic terms, often meant built 3 absolutely enormous pyramids and still wasn't satisfied. Yes, 3. Not 1, not 2, but 3 distinct, colossal pyramid projects. First, the medium pyramid, which apparently started collapsing mid-build. Then the bent pyramid, because they changed the angle halfway through, probably because someone realized the first one was structurally unsound and they were running out of time. Finally, the red pyramid, which they actually got right. 3 attempts, 3 monumental drains on the national coffers, 3 expressions of unchecked royal ambition. Was he good for his people? Perhaps he paid them in grain, but the underlying sin of economic drain, the relentless extraction of resources and labor for personal glorification, remains. He was the guy who bought 3 sports cars before figuring out how to drive one straight. The shift from simple mastabas to these colossal monuments is not merely an architectural evolution, it's a direct, measurable proxy for ego inflation. The bigger the tomb, the bigger the pharaoh's self-regard. It's a literal manifestation of their divine right, carved into the bedrock of Egypt. These aren't just burial sites. They are statements of eternal power, unshakable authority, and an unwavering belief that the entire universe revolved around their magnificent self. And with that ever-expanding ego comes an equally expanding potential for sins. Sins of pride, avarice, exploitation, and a staggering disregard for the daily struggles of the common people who were quite literally building their immortal dreams brick by back-breaking brick. They weren't just building tombs, they were building monuments to their own divine impunity. And now, for the granddaddy of them all, the original influencer, the trendsetter of megalomania, Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid of Giza, a structure so immense it still boggles the mind, even for those of us who have seen its modern equivalents in Dubai, which, let's be honest, probably copied the idea. Khufu is often painted as the archetypal tyrant, a pharaoh whose name conjures images of whip-cracking overseers and endless toil. Was he truly sinful in our modern sense? A malevolent dictator? Or just incredibly, relentlessly, unimaginably demanding? Perhaps it was simply the audacity of his vision that makes him seem so monstrous. He wanted the biggest, the best, the most enduring monument, and he didn't care whose back broke getting it done. It's the sin of scale, of demanding the impossible and then getting it. The logistics of Giza are, frankly, mind-boggling. Imagine coordinating a project that involved tens of thousands of skilled craftsmen, quarrymen, laborers, bakers, brewers, scribes, and administrators, all for one man's eternal slumber. It wasn't slave labor in the traditional sense, but it certainly wasn't a choice for most. It was corvée labor, a polite term for, you owe us your physical existence, peasant, so get to lifting. The sheer scale of forced labor, the meticulous resource allocation, the network of supply lines stretching across Egypt, it's a logistical marvel, yes, but also a logistical nightmare for anyone not wearing a linen skirt and a gold crown. The sins here are subtle yet pervasive. The sins against the common people, who saw their harvests diverted, their able-bodied men conscripted, and their lives dictated by the insatiable demands of a divine ego. It's the silent suffering beneath the monumental achievement. What's truly fascinating, and perhaps a little frustrating for us nosy modern folk, is the near total lack of contemporary accounts about Khufu's personality. We have his pyramid, a few statues, and that's about it. He's a historical enigma, shrouded in the very mystery he sought to transcend. This blank slate, this void of personal detail, allows us to project our own modern sins onto him. We see the ruthless CEO, the unforgiving autocrat, the man who would sacrifice anything for his legacy. He becomes a canvas for our anxieties about unchecked power. Was he a jovial monarch who occasionally threw a worker into the Nile for a laugh, or a stern, quiet visionary? We'll never know. But the fact that his monument still stands, a testament to an unimaginable scale of effort, means his sins, real or imagined, loom just as large. So, what is the enduring legacy of Khufu's colossal folly? Is it a monument to power, a chilling testament to exploitation, or perhaps, in the twisted logic of history, both? It stands as an undeniable symbol of human ingenuity, yes, but also a stark reminder of the cost of absolute authority. Every time you see that iconic triangular silhouette, remember the sweat, the dust, the broken bones, and the quiet resignation of countless lives devoted to one man's immortal sleep. It's a structure that simultaneously inspires awe and a profound, lingering question. Was it really worth it? And the answer, from our comfortable vantage point, is a resounding, sarcastic, probably not for anyone but Khufu. All right, if you thought the pyramids were a bit much, prepare yourselves, because we're about to delve into a royal family tradition that makes your Thanksgiving dinner arguments look positively wholesome. We're talking royal incest, baby. Marrying sisters, daughters, and occasionally, if you were feeling particularly bold, mothers. Yes, really. It was less about finding the one and more about keeping the bloodline so pure it was practically sterile. For us, the very thought sends shivers down the spine, conjuring images from poorly researched horror movies. For them, it was just Tuesday. Now, let's try to wrap our modern, non-incestuous brains around the twisted logic behind this. It wasn't just a kink, believe it or not. The divine imperative was paramount. The pharaoh was a god, a descendant of the gods, specifically Re, the sun god, or Osiris, the god of the afterlife. And gods, apparently, had very limited options when it came to marriage partners. They married their sisters, like Osiris and Isis. Therefore, to maintain their divine status, to ensure the sacred bloodline remained unblemished by the grubby hands of commoners, pharaohs had to follow suit. It was a twisted logic, a performative act of divinity, but it was logic to them. Plus, it kept power firmly within the immediate family, which, let's be honest, was probably the more practical, less celestial reason. But still, deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities, isn't it? It's like a corporate merger, but with uncomfortable family dinners. Examples of this delightful practice begin to surface sporadically in the Old Kingdom, slowly setting a precedent that would become increasingly common and increasingly problematic in later dynasties. It wasn't always the chief royal wife who was a sister, but secondary wives, and the practice of marrying daughters became a thing, solidifying the idea that the pharaoh was literally above human laws. Each instance chipped away at what we'd consider basic ethical boundaries, painting a picture of rulers whose power extended even into the most intimate family arrangements. It was a gradual descent into a genetic cul-de-sac, paved with good intentions of purity and terrible execution of procreation. And, of course, we can't ignore the rather stark health implications. The genetic sins of such rampant inbreeding are well documented. We're talking congenital defects, weakened immune systems, and a generally fragile gene pool that would make a Victorian aristocrat blush. It's a dark, cosmic joke, really. These pharaohs, so obsessed with maintaining a pure bloodline, ended up creating a genetically compromised line, prone to illness and early death. It's the ultimate ironic punishment for divine hubris. Imagine a pharaoh, wrapped in gold and finery, suffering from a chronic sniffle because his great-great-great-grandparents thought marrying first cousins was a stroke of genius. The divine right to rule, it seems, did not extend to a robust immune system, and so the pharaonic family tree became less a majestic oak and more a gnarled, sickly bonsai, struggling to survive its own self-imposed genetic constraints. Quite the sin against future generations, wouldn't you say? Beyond the sacred temples and the monumental tombs lay a less talked about yet equally crucial institution of pharaonic power, the royal harem. Now, before you conjure images of some ancient Egyptian playboy mansion, let's be clear. While pleasure was certainly on the menu, the harem was far more than just a place for royal dalliances. It was a sophisticated, often sprawling complex, a nexus of political alliances, dynastic maneuvering, and, yes, the efficient production of heirs. Imagine a very high-stakes, extremely well-funded boarding school where the curriculum was solely how to produce a future pharaoh, and the headmaster had absolute, unquestionable authority over your entire existence. The pharaoh's right to any woman in his kingdom was a terrifying, yet very real aspect of absolute power. There was no concept of consent as we understand it. If the pharaoh wanted you, you were his. End of discussion. This wasn't just a matter of personal desire. It was a fundamental expression of his divine prerogative. He owned the land, the people, and apparently their reproductive capabilities. Imagine the daily terror, the constant vulnerability for any family with an attractive daughter. This terrifying power was the ultimate sin of ownership, reducing human beings to commodities, instruments for pleasure or progeny at the whim of the divine ruler. It's a stark reminder that beneath the glittering veneer of divine kingship lay a foundation of profound oppression. The lives of the secondary wives and concubines within the harem are often forgotten, lost to the sands of time. They were always subservient, their status precarious, their primary value tied to their ability to bear healthy sons. But to think of them as merely passive ornaments would be a mistake. These women, often from powerful Egyptian families or foreign kingdoms, gifted as diplomatic offerings, like particularly ornate livestock, were not without ambition. They were mothers of potential heirs, wielders of subtle influence, and sometimes incredibly bored individuals with a lot of time on their hands. Life in the harem was a gilded cage, filled with rivalries, whispers, and the constant simmering tension of who might catch the pharaoh's eye next. Their sin, if you can call it that, was often one of quiet desperation and a fierce, often ruthless, maternal protectiveness. And where there's ambition, there are plots. Early harem conspiracies were not as dramatic as those that would rock later dynasties, but the seeds were certainly planted. The subtle nudges, the whispered suggestions, the attempts to discredit a rival's child or elevate one's own, these were the early tremors of the dark undercurrents that would later explode into full-blown assassination attempts and dynastic coups. The harem, a place ostensibly for peace and procreation, was in reality a hotbed of intrigue, a psychological battleground where status, power, and the future of Egypt hung precariously on the pharaoh's affections. It's a dark comedy of manners where the stakes were literally life and death, and the sin was simply playing the game to survive. So, you're the pharaoh. You're not just a king, you're a living god. What does that actually mean for the millions of sun-baked, tax-paying, Nile-dependent peasants under your thumb? Well, it means everything and absolutely nothing all at once. It means your subjects aren't just loyal, they're reverent. They don't just obey, they worship. It means your bad hair day is a sign of cosmic displeasure, and your annual bath is a sacred ritual. Your existence is the very hinge upon which the universe turns. For the average Egyptian, it meant a constant, pervasive sense of being in the presence of the divine, and a rather stark reminder that challenging this divinity was not just treason, but blasphemy. And blasphemy, as history reliably informs us, usually ends with a very sharp object and a very public display. This divine status required constant affirmation. You couldn't just say you were a god, you had to prove it, daily, forever. This translated into an endless, self-aggrandizing PR campaign that would make a modern influencer blush. Temples were built, statues erected, and offerings made, all in the pharaoh's name, or often directly to the pharaoh. Every harvest festival, every ritual, every prayer was another brick in the edifice of his divine identity. It was a feedback loop of monumental proportions. The pharaoh claimed divinity, the priests and populace affirmed it, which in turn strengthened the pharaoh's claim. And who paid for all this divine affirmation? You guessed it, the common people, through their labor and their taxes. The sin here is not just vanity, but the systematic construction of an ideological prison designed to justify absolute power and drain national resources for self-serving piety. And this carefully cultivated divine status justified every conceivable action, no matter how sinful it might appear to our sensitive modern eyes. Conquering a neighboring land? Divine will. Marrying your sister? Divine tradition. Demanding every able-bodied man build your giant golden pyramid? Divine decree. There was no act too extreme, no demand too unreasonable, no abuse too egregious that couldn't be rationalized by the simple phrase, "Because I am a god, and gods do what they please." It was the ultimate moral get-out-of-jail-free card, stamped with the seal of cosmic authority. Any suffering, any exploitation, any cruelty was simply part of the divine plan, a necessary component of maintaining Ma'at, even if Ma'at seemed suspiciously aligned with the pharaoh's personal agenda. So, from the common people's perspective, did they truly believe in this divine charade, or was it just plain old survival? It's a question that echoes through the dusty corridors of history. Did the farmer, bent double in the fields, genuinely think his ruler was a sun god incarnate, or did he simply understand the brutal consequences of dissent? Most likely, it was a complex blend. Belief, or at least outward conformity, was a powerful social glue. It provided order, explained the inexplicable, like why some people got all the gold, and offered a comforting narrative in a harsh world. But beneath the surface, there must have been whispers, cynical glances, and the quiet resignation that comes with living under an unchallengeable authority. The sin of the pharaohs, in this context, wasn't just their actions, but their deliberate cultivation of a system that compelled belief, or, at the very least, terrified obedience. The first intermediate period. Imagine, if you will, that the divine CEO of Egypt suddenly loses his internet connection. The central server crashes, the apps stop working. What happens when the living God loses his iron grip? Utter, glorious, terrifying chaos, that's what. The Old Kingdom, with its majestic pyramids and unified rule, dissolved into a patchwork of squabbling fiefdoms, a testament to the fragile nature of even divinely sanctioned power. It was like a particularly messy divorce, where the children, the regional governors, started claiming separate houses and raiding the joint bank account. Suddenly, everyone had a say, and no one could agree on anything. This was the age of local warlords and competing dynasties, a free-for-all of power grabs and petty tyrannies. Imagine your local mayor suddenly declaring himself king, raising a personal army, and demanding tribute from the next town over. Now multiply that by 20. The pharaoh in Memphis was a king in name only, often powerless to enforce his will beyond his immediate vicinity. The nomarchs, the regional governors who once served the central authority, now became de facto monarchs, fighting over irrigation rights, raiding each other's cattle, and generally behaving like disgruntled feudal lords. The sin here is less about one colossal ego and more about 1,000 petty egos, each convinced of their own local supremacy, each contributing to the utter disintegration of what was once a unified, if exploitative, state. The greatest sin of this period was the widespread disunity itself. The breakdown of central order led to widespread suffering. Without a strong central authority to manage the Nile's floods, coordinate irrigation, and ensure equitable distribution of resources, famine became rampant. Trade routes became dangerous, banditry flourished, and the social fabric frayed like an old linen tunic. The very ma'at that the pharaohs were supposed to uphold completely collapsed. It was a period of existential dread for the common people, who suddenly found themselves at the mercy of feuding warlords instead of a single, albeit oppressive, divine entity. The sin of disunity is perhaps the most insidious, as it allows 1,000 smaller evils to fester and flourish. Curiously, this period of chaos also gave rise to some fascinating shifts in cultural thought. We see the emergence of the coffin texts, a sort of democratized afterlife guide. Suddenly, the journey to the duat wasn't just for pharaohs and high officials. Ordinary Egyptians could now, through the right spells and rituals, aspire to an eternal existence. It was perhaps a direct reaction to the pharaonic excess that preceded it. If the living God couldn't even guarantee order on earth, perhaps the common man could at least secure his own afterlife. It's a glimmer of hope, a tiny flicker of spiritual egalitarianism amidst the political breakdown. A delicious irony, really. The sins of the pharaohs ultimately paved the way for the spiritual liberation of the very people they exploited. Who knew chaos could be so inclusive? All right, deep breath. The chaos of the first intermediate period eventually settled, like dust after a particularly vigorous sandstorm, giving way to the relative stability of the Middle Kingdom. This was hailed as a period of reform, a time when pharaohs supposedly learned their lessons. They weren't just divine despots anymore. They were good shepherds guiding their flock. But let's be realistic, shall we? Reform in ancient Egypt rarely meant redemption. It often just meant better PR and a slightly more sophisticated way of extracting resources. The wolves might have put on sheep's clothing, but they still had very sharp teeth. The propaganda of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs shifted dramatically. Gone was the overt, blunt force divinity of the Old Kingdom. Now, pharaohs presented themselves as concerned caretakers, responsible for the welfare of their people. They were the shepherds of Egypt, subtly contrasting themselves with the allegedly tyrannical Old Kingdom despots, while conveniently forgetting their own ancestors' rather similar behavior. It was a savvy rebranding exercise, a softer sell for absolute power. Look, they seem to say, we're still gods, yes, but we're empathetic gods. We might still demand your labor, but we'll occasionally pat you on the head while you're toiling. This image of the benevolent ruler was a powerful piece of psychological warfare designed to foster loyalty rather than pure terror. Take Senusret III, for example. A powerful, stern ruler who fortified Egypt's borders, expanded its influence into Nubia, and streamlined the administration. He's often depicted with a rather weary, almost sorrowful expression, hinting at the burden of leadership. Was his strictness a sin or a necessity in a world still recovering from fragmentation? Hard to say. From our modern perspective, strictness can quickly become authoritarianism. He centralized power, curtailed the influence of the regional nomarchs, and basically put everyone back in their place. He was effective, no doubt, but was that effectiveness achieved through just governance or through a more insidious, quiet form of oppression? The sin here might not be overt cruelty, but the stifling of local autonomy and the reestablishment of a system where individual agency was consistently subservient to royal decree. The Middle Kingdom, therefore, saw a shift from colossal, obvious sins to more internal, bureaucratic ones. The days of simply ordering a mountain of stone to be moved were somewhat behind them. Now we're talking about corruption, favoritism, and subtle abuses of power festering within the very administrative system designed to ensure order. Imagine a government where nepotism wasn't just common, but practically a job requirement. Where resources disappeared into obscure royal projects or into the pockets of well-connected officials. These were the quiet abuses, the insidious erosions of fairness that don't make for dramatic tomb paintings, but steadily chip away at a society's foundations. The shepherd might have looked good on the outside, but underneath the fleece, the same old wolves were still running the show, just with a more sophisticated accounting system. And speaking of Middle Kingdom good shepherds with questionable priorities, let's turn our attention to Amenemhat III, a king who, much like his predecessors, sought to consolidate power and leave a lasting impression. His monumental achievement, aside from draining an entire oasis, was the construction of the infamous labyrinth at Hawara. This wasn't just a temple or a tomb, it was a complex so vast and intricate that ancient Greek historians like Herodotus described it with awe and bewilderment. Imagine a building containing 3,000 rooms, half above ground, half below, filled with winding passages, secret chambers, and enough deceptive dead ends to make a modern IKEA look like a straightforward hallway. It was another massive, resource-intensive project, a testament to royal ambition, but also to a burgeoning obsession with control and exclusivity. This tightening of royal control was a hallmark of Amenemhat III's reign. The sins here aren't the dramatic abuses of earlier eras, but a more pervasive, almost suffocating surveillance. He centralized the bureaucracy even further, established tight control over the economy, and essentially managed Egypt like a particularly efficient, albeit ruthless, corporate entity. Every aspect of life, from farming to temple administration, fell under the watchful eye of the pharaoh's labyrinthine administration. It was less about brute force and more about the quiet hum of an omnipresent state apparatus, ensuring compliance through intricate regulations and the occasional, very pointed reminder of who was truly in charge. His sin was perhaps the invention of the ancient Egyptian surveillance state, where privacy was a foreign concept and loyalty was less about love and more about meticulously documented obedience. Perhaps the most blatant example of his control obsession was the exploitation of the Fayum oasis. This naturally fertile region, a lush anomaly in the desert, became Amenemhat III's personal agricultural playground. He embarked on a masterclass in environmental manipulation, building canals, dikes, and reservoirs to reclaim vast tracts of land for cultivation. On the surface, this sounds like a benevolent act, increasing Egypt's agricultural output. But it was primarily for royal gain. The Fayum became the breadbasket of the crown, ensuring immense wealth and food supplies directly for the pharaoh and his elite, while further entrenching the system of state-controlled resources. It's the sin of ecological hubris, bending nature to the will of one man, not necessarily for the benefit of all, but for the aggrandizement of the few. And so, this period of immense, albeit controlled, prosperity eventually gave way to internal decay. The very tightening of control that defined the Middle Kingdom ultimately led to external vulnerability. The pharaohs grew increasingly isolated. The central administration became too top-heavy, and the resources, despite their apparent abundance, were stretched thin by the relentless demands of a powerful elite and their monumental projects. The labyrinth, a symbol of control, became a metaphor for the intricate, confusing, and ultimately unsustainable system that Egypt had become. The Middle Kingdom, for all its supposed reforms, ended not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding whimper, leaving the door open for the next wave of chaos. Because in ancient Egypt, like in a particularly addictive reality show, the drama always returns. Just when you thought Egypt had learned its lesson about fragmentation and weakness, bam! The second intermediate period rolls around, bringing with it a whole new level of existential dread: foreign invaders, specifically the Hyksos. These weren't your friendly neighborhood tourists. They were a group of Semitic peoples from the Near East who, armed with superior chariots and composite bows, swept into the Nile Delta like an uninvited, extremely aggressive houseguest and promptly set up shop. It was a rude awakening for Egyptian pharaohs, who had rather smugly believed their divine protection extended to keeping pesky foreigners out of their perfectly ordered kingdom. Apparently, the gods were having an off day. The most profound sin of this period, from the perspective of the native Egyptian pharaohs, was weakness. How could these divine rulers, descendants of the sun god himself, justify their inability to protect the sacred land of Egypt from these interlopers? It was an ideological crisis of monumental proportions. If the pharaoh was the guarantor of Ma'at, and Ma'at included the territorial integrity of Egypt, then clearly something had gone terribly, cosmically wrong. The sin of military failure, of political impotence, gnawed at the heart of the traditional pharaonic narrative. It challenged their very divinity, suggesting that perhaps, just perhaps, they weren't as hot stuff as they claimed. It's the ultimate humility check, delivered with chariots and a very distinct lack of Egyptian accents. But even in the depths of perceived failure, Heroes, or at least fiercely brutal resistance fighters, emerge. Enter Kamose and Sekenenre Tao, the last native pharaohs of the 17th dynasty, who decided enough was enough. These were not the placid, shepherd-like kings of the Middle Kingdom. These were warriors, and their sins were perhaps necessary brutality in a fight for national survival. They waged a fierce, often gruesome, campaign against the Hyksos, sacrificing themselves. Sekenenre Tao famously died in battle, his mummy bearing the horrific wounds of an axe blow to the head, to push back the invaders. Was their ruthlessness a sin when the very existence of Egypt was at stake? In the crucible of war, morality often becomes a luxury, and survival the only virtue. It's the classic ends justify the means dilemma, only with more severed limbs and less philosophical debate. The Hyksos occupation, however, wasn't all doom and gloom. It led to the introduction of new customs, new technologies, hello chariots and composite bows, and perhaps even new sins from foreign rulers. They brought with them their own gods, their own administrative practices, and a cultural blend that, while initially jarring, ultimately enriched Egyptian civilization. But for the native Egyptians, it was a period of humiliation, a wound that would fester for generations. The sin of foreign occupation for the pharaohs who lived through it was unforgivable. It was a stain on their divine lineage, a challenge to their cosmic authority, and a debt that would eventually be repaid with extreme prejudice, because in ancient Egypt, even the gods held a grudge. After the indignity of the Hyksos occupation, Egypt needed a hero, and like a perfectly timed dramatic entrance, along came Ahmose I, sweeping in to reclaim Egypt's glory. His expulsion of the Hyksos wasn't just a military victory. It was a moment of profound national pride, a psychological reboot for a civilization that had been forced to share its divine sandbox with uninvited guests. Imagine the collective sigh of relief, the celebratory feasting, the feeling that Ma'at had finally, gloriously, returned to its rightful place. Ahmose was hailed as the liberator, the man who single-handedly kicked out the invaders and set Egypt back on its glorious pharaonic path. But here's the thing about liberators. They rarely stop at liberation. Ahmose wasn't just content to get rid of the Hyksos. He used his victory to consolidate power, establishing a new, even more powerful monarchy, the New Kingdom. This wasn't merely about restoring the old ways. It was about building a stronger, more centralized, and infinitely more ambitious state. He wasn't just cleaning house, he was renovating with extreme prejudice, ensuring that no regional lord or upstart minor king would ever challenge the pharaoh's authority again. The sin here isn't malicious, but it's the quiet, almost inevitable sin of the opportunist, taking a moment of national triumph and leveraging it for personal and dynastic gain, creating an even more formidable machine of absolute rule. With this new, robust monarchy came the reestablishment of divine kingship, but with a vengeance. The pharaoh was not just a god, he was a warrior god, a protector, a unifier. The narrative shifted from the humble shepherd of the Middle Kingdom to the triumphant, all-conquering deity. Temples were rebuilt, rituals reestablished, and the ideological foundations of absolute rule were cemented more firmly than ever before. Any lingering doubts about the pharaoh's divinity, any whispers of weakness, were drowned out by the thunder of his chariots and the dazzling display of his newly acquired wealth. The sin of hubris, of self-glorification, was back with a vengeance, bigger and bolder than ever. And then came the initial, tentative steps toward empire building. Having successfully defended Egypt, Ahmose decided the best defense was a really, really good offense. He pursued the Hyksos deep into Palestine, conquering territories and establishing a buffer zone that would eventually blossom into a full-fledged Egyptian empire. This was the sin of conquest, disguised as national security. It was justified as bringing order to the chaotic fringes, bringing the enlightenment of Ma'at to the barbarians. But at its heart, it was about power, resources, and securing Egypt's dominance. Thousands were killed, enslaved, or subjected to Egyptian rule. The era of glorious, unapologetic imperialism had begun, setting the stage for centuries of aggressive expansion and the associated moral compromises that come with wielding immense power over others. Ahmose, the liberator, was also the architect of an empire, and empires, as we know, are rarely built on purely virtuous intentions. And now for a delightful detour into gender politics, ancient Egyptian style. Enter Hatshepsut, the woman who single-handedly shattered the bronze ceiling and dared to be king. Not queen regnant, mind you, but actual, full-blown, beard-wearing pharaoh. Her initial sin, in the eyes of the deeply patriarchal Egyptian society, was simply one of audacious ambition. A woman usurping a man's role. It was an unprecedented move, a cosmic disruption, a blatant challenge to millennia of tradition. Imagine the pearl-clutching, the scandalized whispers among the temple priests. A woman on the throne? What next? A cow wearing a crown? Hatshepsut, however, was no fool. She understood that power in Egypt wasn't just about armies, it was about propaganda, and she was a master. She didn't just claim the throne, she manufactured her own divine birth story, depicting the god Amun impregnating her mother. She had herself portrayed with all the regalia of a male pharaoh, including the traditional false beard and muscular physique, essentially photoshopping herself into legitimacy. It was a brilliant, if utterly deceptive, performance. She wasn't just a woman ruling, she was literally transforming herself into the embodiment of kingship. Gender be damned. Her sin of ambition was matched only by her sin of audacious self-reinvention, a historical drag king act designed to ensure her rule. And what a lavish reign it was. Hatshepsut wasn't building pyramids, but her architectural projects were breathtaking in their scale and artistry. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is a masterpiece, a terraced wonderland carved into the cliffs. She launched expeditions to the mythical land of Punt, bringing back exotic goods, frankincense, myrrh, gold, and even live trees. Was all this for the glory and prosperity of Egypt, or was it primarily for her ego, to solidify her controversial claim to power and outshine her male predecessors? Probably a healthy mix of both. The sin here is the age-old question of leadership. When does benevolent governance cross the line into self-aggrandizing display? For Hatshepsut, every magnificent project was a justification, a tangible proof of her divine right to rule, regardless of her chromosomes. But, as with all great stories of ambition, there's a dark twist. Decades after her death, her memory was systematically erased. Her statues were toppled, her images defaced, her name chiseled from inscriptions. This was the ultimate sin against a deceased monarch, a damnatio memoriae, designed to wipe her from the historical record. Who did it? Most scholars point a finger at her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, who likely nursed a lifetime of resentment for being sidelined. It was an act of political vengeance, a reassertion of patriarchal order, and a chilling reminder that even the most powerful pharaohs were vulnerable to the shifting tides of history and the spite of their successors. Hatshepsut's legacy, for a time, was almost completely swallowed by the sands, a testament to the brutal, unforgiving nature of pharaonic power plays. All right, time for some good old-fashioned sibling rivalry, ancient Egyptian style. Or rather, stepson-stepmother rivalry, which, let's face it, is always more deliciously complicated. Enter Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt, a military genius who spent his early years chafing under the unprecedented rule of his stepmother, Hatshepsut. Once he finally grasped the reins of power after her death, his first order of business wasn't just to rule, but to enact a slow, methodical, and utterly systematic revenge, the defacement of Hatshepsut's monuments. It was a centuries-long act of spite, a meticulous erasing of her memory, a sin of vengeance so thorough it almost worked. Every chipped relief, every defaced statue, every scraped-out cartouche was a quiet scream of, "I told you so," and "This is my legacy, not hers." But Thutmose III wasn't just a petty defacer of statues. He was a conqueror of epic proportions. His military campaigns were relentless, sweeping through the Near East, expanding the Egyptian empire to its greatest territorial extent. We're talking 17 campaigns in 20 years, a pace that would exhaust a modern military logistics team just thinking about it. Thousands were killed, enslaved, conquered, and forced to pay tribute. Was this sinful? In the context of ancient warfare, perhaps not. But from our modern vantage point, it's a stark reminder of the brutality of imperialism, the systematic subjugation of peoples, the destruction of cultures, all for the glory and resources of the conquering power. He was a strategic genius, yes, but his genius was built on the lives and liberties of countless non-Egyptians. And the spoils of war. The spoils. Imagine the immense wealth flooding into Egypt. Gold, silver, bronze, cattle, slaves, timber, exotic resins. Temples grew richer, the pharaoh's treasury overflowed, and Egypt became the undisputed superpower of the ancient world. This wealth was undeniably impressive, financing monumental building projects and the lavish lifestyles of the elite. But it came at a great human cost. The sin here is not just the act of conquest, but the systemic exploitation that followed. The wealth of Egypt was built on the subjugation of others, a constant stream of tribute and forced labor. It's the uncomfortable truth behind every glorious empire. Someone always pays the price, and it's rarely the guy wearing the crown. This, then, was the sin of imperialism, justified, as always, as bringing order to chaotic lands, bringing the enlightenment of Egyptian culture to the less fortunate, i.e., less powerful, barbarians. But primarily, it was about power, resources, and the insatiable ambition of a pharaoh determined to outshine every predecessor. Thutmose III consolidated and expanded the empire, turning Egypt into a truly formidable global player. He ensured his own eternal fame through conquest and monumental construction, forever cementing his place in history as a military titan. But every empire, no matter how glorious, leaves a trail of tears and blood, and Thutmose III's legacy is no exception. He was a testament to what happens when you combine divine right with a serious case of delayed gratification and a very big army. Prepare yourselves for the rock star pharaoh of the New Kingdom, Amenhotep III. This was a man who didn't just rule, he lived. His reign was one of unparalleled opulence, a golden age where Egypt was at the absolute peak of its power and wealth. And with that power and wealth came the sins of extreme luxury and self-indulgence on a scale that makes your average celebrity mansion look like a cramped studio apartment. Imagine a king who genuinely believed he was the sun, moon, and stars, and had the entire national treasury to fund that delusion. He was the magnificent, and magnificently self-absorbed. His palace at Malkata, on the west bank of Thebes, wasn't just a palace. It was a pleasure dome worthy of any modern rock star, a sprawling complex that covered over 80 acres. We're talking massive ceremonial halls, residential quarters, gardens, temples, and even an artificial lake. This wasn't built for administrative efficiency. It was built for spectacle, for lavish parties, for demonstrating unimaginable wealth. Imagine the parties, the feasts, the endless flow of wine and exotic entertainment. It was the ultimate ancient Egyptian VIP lounge, accessible only to the truly privileged. The sin here is the sheer, unadulterated hedonism, the gluttonous consumption of resources for personal pleasure, while most of the population continued their back-breaking labor. And then there's the infamous serpentine sin. Did he really have a sacred lake constructed purely for his pleasure? A massive body of water where he and his queens could cruise around in barges, perhaps with a retinue of beautiful young attendants? Yes, he absolutely did. It was 2.5 kilometers long and almost a kilometer wide, an absolutely insane undertaking of digging and water management, all so the pharaoh could enjoy a leisurely afternoon sail. It's the ultimate expression of because I can. The environmental impact, the labor, the sheer audacity of it all, it boggles the mind. It makes you wonder if anyone ever whispered, maybe we could just, build another granary? Probably not, because that would be blasphemy. Amenhotep III was also a master of diplomacy, but it was a diplomacy heavily skewed in his favor. The Amarna letters, a trove of diplomatic correspondence, reveal a king who expected tribute and lavish gifts from foreign powers, while offering little in return beyond a polite nod and perhaps a token marriage alliance, where his daughters were sent off to marry foreign kings, but never vice versa, of course. He was the ultimate ancient Egyptian gatekeeper, holding court from his golden palace, demanding deference and showering his chosen favorites with gold. The sin here is the blatant economic exploitation of international relations, dressed up as benevolent diplomacy. His face was everywhere. His statues, reliefs, and even small scarabs bearing his name proliferated throughout Egypt and beyond. It was brand recognition on a truly unprecedented scale. Every corner you turned, there was Amenhotep III, looking magnificent, powerful, and utterly divine. He wasn't just a pharaoh, he was a living brand, synonymous with power, wealth, and the blessings of the gods. The sin of megalomania reached its zenith with Amenhotep III, a pharaoh so enamored with his own image that he flooded the world with it, ensuring that his magnificent, self-indulgent reign would be etched into eternity. Behind every magnificent, debauched, gold-obsessed pharaoh, there's often an equally formidable woman, and in the case of Amenhotep III, that woman was Queen Tai. She wasn't born into royalty. She was the daughter of a prominent official, but she swiftly became the great royal wife, and her influence was unprecedented. Unlike previous queens, who often faded into the background after producing an heir, Taye was a constant, visible presence at her husband's side, often depicted in public monuments as his equal. This was a challenge to traditional royal power dynamics, a sin of female assertion in a world that typically relegated women to the domestic sphere. Taya's role in the court was immense. She participated in official ceremonies, corresponded with foreign dignitaries, and was clearly a trusted advisor to her husband. The question, of course, is whether she was a force for good, a moderating influence on Amenhotep III's excesses, or if she simply enabled them, enjoying the fruits of absolute power alongside him. History, unfortunately, doesn't record her inner thoughts, but given the opulence of the court, it's safe to assume she wasn't exactly living a monastic life. Her sin might have been one of complicity, of leveraging her unique position not to challenge the system, but to thrive within its luxurious confines. The challenges she posed to traditional royal power dynamics were subtle but significant. Her children, including the future Akhenaten, were future pharaohs, and her influence on their upbringing and early perspectives cannot be overstated. She was a mother, a queen, and a political operator all rolled into one, navigating a complex web of court intrigue and dynastic ambition. She was a testament to the power a clever woman could wield, even in a system designed to suppress her. Her very existence, her prominence, was a quiet revolution. This, then, was the sin of quiet manipulation, the subtle exertion of power by a woman in a fiercely patriarchal system. Tai wasn't leading armies or declaring herself pharaoh. That would come later, with Hatshepsut's ghost perhaps whispering in other royal ears. Her power was more insidious, more pervasive. It was the power of influence, of counsel, of being an indispensable partner to a ruler who perhaps recognized her intelligence and acumen. She pulled strings from behind the scenes, subtly shaping policy and guiding the direction of the empire. While not a direct sin of rebellion, her prominence chipped away at traditional male-dominated structures, perhaps paving the way for even more radical changes to come. And boy, would they come. And now for the main event, the grand theatrical performance of pharaonic sin that shocked ancient Egypt to its core, Akhenaten's heresy. Imagine a modern megachurch pastor suddenly declaring that God is actually a giant invisible spaghetti monster and everyone else's gods are fake. That's roughly the level of disruption Akhenaten unleashed. His ultimate sin against tradition was not just questioning the old gods, but actively abandoning them for his singular deity, the Aten, the sun disk itself. It was a theological mic drop, a religious revolution that made everyone else look like they were still playing with ancient myths. Was this monotheistic revolution a profound philosophical shift, the first glimmer of true monotheism in human history? Or was it simply a cynical power grab by a pharaoh who was tired of sharing authority with the immensely powerful priests of Amun at Thebes? Probably both, with a generous helping of megalomania for good measure. Akhenaten wasn't just interested in a new god. He was interested in a new god whose sole point of contact with humanity was him, the pharaoh. Convenient, isn't it? The Aten had no complex mythology, no multitude of priests, no ancient traditions to challenge Akhenaten's supreme authority. It was a streamlined, minimalist religion, with the pharaoh as the sole intermediary. The sin here is not just heresy, but the weaponization of religion for absolute political control. To drive home his point, Akhenaten didn't just abandon the old gods, he abandoned Thebes, the ancient capital, the seat of Amun's power. He founded a brand new city, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, built from scratch in a pristine desert valley, dedicated solely to the Aten and to his own radical vision. Imagine canceling your nation's capital and starting over, just because you didn't like the old god's fan club. It was a massive, expensive undertaking, a testament to one man's unwavering or utterly deluded conviction. The sin of monumental waste, of forcing an entire population to uproot their lives, all for a pharaoh's religious whim, is almost secondary to the sheer audacity of the act. And if you weren't on board with the new religion, well, Akhenaten had thoughts on that too. The persecution of the old god's priests was swift and brutal. Their temples were closed, their estates confiscated, and their names systematically chiseled from monuments. The economic ruin of the powerful Amun priesthood was complete, and forced conversion, or at least forced silence, became the order of the day. Imagine being a priest of Amun, a respected figure in society, only to wake up one morning and find your god deemed illegitimate, your livelihood destroyed, and your entire way of life outlawed. It's the sin of religious tyranny, of intellectual authoritarianism, where dogma is enforced with the full might of the state and dissent is met with extreme prejudice. Akhenaten was a revolutionary, yes, but a revolutionary who believed his revolution was the only one that mattered. And beside every radical, heretical pharaoh, there's often an equally enigmatic and beautiful queen. Enter Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one has come. Her iconic bust, with its elegant neck and serene expression, remains one of the most famous pieces of ancient art. Unlike previous queens, Nefertiti was often depicted as Akhenaten's mere equal, standing by his side in religious ceremonies, driving chariots, and even striking down enemies. This prominent role was truly unprecedented, a clear departure from traditional female roles in the royal court, and a sin of female empowerment that ruffled many traditional feathers. Her prominent role raises a fascinating question. Was she a true believer in Akhenaten's Atenist revolution, a zealous co-conspirator in his religious upheaval? Or was she merely an opportunist, leveraging her position to wield immense power in a dramatically shifting landscape? It's impossible to know for sure, but her consistent presence in the Amarna art suggests a deep involvement, if not genuine conviction. Perhaps she saw the appeal of a new order, where traditional hierarchies, including gender roles, were being challenged. Her sin of complicity, if it was indeed a sin, lay in her active participation in a religious purge that caused immense social and economic disruption for millions of Egyptians. Then, as dramatically as she appeared, Nefertiti mysteriously vanishes from the historical record around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign. Did she fall from grace, suffer an early death, or perhaps take on a new identity, even ruling as a co-regent under a male name, like Smenkhkare or Neferneferuaten? The speculation is endless, fueling centuries of scholarly debate and countless historical romances. Her disappearance adds another layer of intrigue to an already tumultuous period, suggesting internal struggles even within Akhenaten's radical court. The sin of historical vanishing act, perhaps, leaving us all scratching our heads for millennia. The political ramifications of her influence during this period of upheaval cannot be overstated. With the pharaoh singularly focused on his religious reforms, Nefertiti likely played a crucial role in the day-to-day governance of the empire. She was a key figure in the Amarna experiment, a power player in a moment of profound change. Her presence, her decisions, and her eventual disappearance were all integral to the trajectory of Akhenaten's revolution and its eventual, inevitable collapse. She was a queen who dared to stand in the sun, and for a brief, dazzling moment, she shone almost as brightly as the Aten itself. If you thought royal incest was disturbing before, prepare yourself, because the Amarna royal family decided to take that peculiar pharaonic tradition and dial it up to 11. Akhenaten, the great religious reformer, apparently saw no issue with marrying his own daughters, specifically Meritaten and Ankhesenpaten, who would later become Ankhesenamun, wife of Tutankhamun. Even by the already warped pharaonic standards, this was pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. It wasn't just about divine purity anymore. It felt like a desperate attempt to create an entirely new, uber-divine bloodline, uncontaminated by anyone outside their strange little Atenist bubble. The sin here is the willful disregard for even their own cultural norms, a descent into a genetic and moral cul-de-sac. And the inbred children, the tragic consequences. We'll get to Tutankhamun later, but suffice it to say, his numerous health issues, clubfoot, malarial infections, bone necrosis, are a direct and undeniable legacy of his parents' and likely grandparents' incestuous sins. It's a chilling reminder that even divine rulers cannot escape the laws of biology. Imagine a family so obsessed with maintaining their supposed celestial purity that they literally bred themselves into genetic fragility. It's a dark, karmic punchline to Akhenaten's grand religious experiment, where the quest for divine perfection resulted in very human imperfection and suffering. But Amarna wasn't just a hotbed of genetic anomalies, it was also a crucible of artistic revolution. Gone were the stiff, idealized, eternally youthful depictions of previous pharaohs. Amarna art was shockingly intimate, almost brutally honest. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters were shown with elongated heads, slender limbs, and often prominent bellies. They engaged in intimate family scenes, kissing their children, lounging casually. For traditionalists, this was blasphemy. How dare you depict a divine pharaoh with human imperfections, playing with his kids like a commoner? It challenged every established aesthetic and religious convention. Was it blasphemy or a radical honesty? A glimpse into the actual, if somewhat distorted, humanity of these rulers. Either way, it was a profound sin against traditional artistic and religious dogma. All these radical changes, religious, artistic, and dynastic, created immense social turmoil. The abrupt abandonment of the old gods alienated millions. The forced relocation to Amarna disrupted countless lives, and the economic fallout from closing temples and shifting power structures sent shockwaves throughout Egypt. The common people, accustomed to a stable, if oppressive, cosmic order, suddenly found their world turned upside down. The sins of the Amarna family were not just their personal proclivities, but the widespread disruption and suffering they inflicted upon an entire nation in their pursuit of a singular revolutionary vision. It was a turbulent, fascinating, and ultimately catastrophic experiment in divine rule. From the radical, sun-drenched chaos of Amarna, we plunge into the brief, tragic reign of its most famous and famously cursed product, Tutankhamun, the Boy King. His greatest sin, if you can call it that, was being a puppet. He inherited a kingdom in disarray, a religious vacuum, and a council of powerful regents who were far more interested in undoing his father's mess than in listening to a child's opinions. He became pharaoh at around 9 years old, a mere figurehead, signing off on the restoration of the old gods and the abandonment of Amarna, likely under the heavy influence of figures like Ai and Horemheb. He was a pawn in a much larger political game, a convenient symbol for the return to tradition, a young face to placate a traumatized nation. The cursed tomb narrative. A deliciously dark superstition that has captivated imaginations for a century. More a PR coup for sensationalist journalism than an actual sin, perhaps, but still darkly fascinating. The whispers of mysterious deaths, the dramatic unveiling of the golden mask, it all adds to the mystique of a king whose actual reign was largely uneventful. The curse serves as a morbidly amusing footnote to the real tragedy. A young man used, manipulated, and ultimately lost to the sands of time, only to be resurrected by the flick of a journalist's pen. But the real tragedy, the true sin woven into Tutankhamun's very being, lay in his likely inbred health issues. Scientific studies of his mummy reveal a grim litany of ailments: a severe clubfoot, requiring a cane, of which 130 were found in his tomb, bone necrosis, tissue death due to poor blood supply, and multiple strains of malaria. This was a direct, horrifying consequence of his parents, Akhenaten and one of his sisters, pharaonic sins of incest. Here was a boy suffering from chronic pain and illness simply because his family tree resembled a tangled bush of self-congratulation. It's a poignant, visceral reminder that the divine claims of pharaohs could not protect them or their children from the very real consequences of biological folly. His enduring fame, then, is a bizarre historical irony. He is not celebrated for his deeds, for his military campaigns, or his great building projects. He is famous purely for his intact burial, for the sheer serendipity of having his tomb escape the rampant looting that befell almost all other pharaonic resting places. His golden mask, his chariots, his astonishing collection of treasures, these are the lasting monuments, not to his rule, but to the brevity and tragic nature of his actual reign. He was a ghost in his own story, a footnote in life, who became a colossal headline in death, a testament to the fact that sometimes, in history, it's not what you do, but what you leave behind. From the Boy King, we turn our attention to the old fox, the ultimate political survivor, Ai. This man was a chameleon, a master of adaptation, a courtier who somehow managed to navigate the treacherous waters of Akhenaten's radical heresy and the brief puppet-like reign of Tutankhamun, only to end up on the throne himself. How did he do it? By being supremely opportunistic, endlessly pragmatic, and probably a little bit ruthless. He was the guy who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, with the right words for whoever held power. His sin, if you can call it that, was pure, unadulterated political opportunism. His path to the throne involved what we might charitably call usurpation, though naked power grab feels more accurate. Upon Tutankhamun's sudden death, I, then the chief vizier and commander of the army, swiftly married Tutankhamun's widow, Ankhesenamun, Akhenaten's daughter, remember? This was a deeply problematic union, as she was likely his granddaughter, and certainly much, much younger than him. Did she agree willingly? A recently discovered letter from Ankhesenamun to the Hittite king requesting a son to marry because she refused to marry a servant from her own land suggests she was desperate to avoid a forced marriage to someone beneath her. A certainly fit that description, despite his power. The sin of marrying a vulnerable young queen, possibly under duress, to legitimize his claim is a dark stain on his brief reign. And a short, unremarkable reign it was. I was a placeholder pharaoh, a brief interregnum between the dramatic Amarna period and the rise of the military strongmen. He ruled for only a few years, spending most of his time trying to steer the ship of state back to traditionalism, while quietly consolidating his own power and securing his own burial. His sin here is perhaps less about grand evil and more about the quiet manipulations of a seasoned bureaucrat, a man who had seen too much and understood that power was a fleeting commodity, best enjoyed while you had it. He was the ultimate behind-the-scenes operator, suddenly finding himself in the spotlight and making the most of it. His role in the Amarna aftermath was crucial. He was instrumental in overseeing the restoration of the old gods, the dismantling of Akhenaten's religious experiment, and the very delicate process of trying to put Egypt back together again. While he participated in the destruction of Amarna, he carefully avoided directly implicating himself too deeply in the full eradication of Akhenaten's memory, perhaps hoping to preserve some semblance of legitimacy. Aya was a master manipulator, a survivor par excellence, whose sins were perhaps less about divine transgression and more about the earthly, grubby business of power politics. He wasn't a hero, but he was certainly effective, a testament to the enduring power of ambition and strategic self-interest in the halls of ancient power. Chapter 22. Horemheb, the general who seized the crown and erased history again. If I was the old fox, then Horemheb was the roaring lion, a military general who had served under Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and I. He watched the Amarna chaos unfold and decided enough was enough. When I died without an heir, Horemheb simply bypassed the traditional lines of succession and took the throne. This was the sin of brute force, a military coup dressed up as a restoration of order. Imagine a highly decorated general, tired of the political games, simply marching into the palace and declaring, "My turn, and this time we're doing things properly." And by properly, he meant with an iron fist and a very sharp chisel. Horemheb understood that to truly erase the Amarna heresy, you didn't just need to restore the old gods. You needed to wipe the slate clean. And so he embarked on a systematic destruction of Amarna, not just Akhenaten's legacy, but that of Tutankhamun and I as well. Their monuments were dismantled, their names obliterated, their statues smashed and recycled into his own building projects. It was a monumental act of damnatio memoria, designed to make it seem as though these problematic pharaohs had never existed. His sin here is the willful erasure of history, the attempt to rewrite the past to suit the present political narrative. He was the ultimate editor, with the power to literally delete entire chapters from the nation's story. His reign was certainly one of restoration of order. He reformed the army, stabilized the administration, and put an end to the internal chaos that had plagued Egypt for decades. Was it for the good of Egypt, or merely to legitimize his own rule and create a stable platform for his chosen successor? Again, likely both. A stable Egypt benefited everyone, but Horemheb was also consolidating immense power in his own hands, establishing a precedent for military leaders to seize the throne. His sin was perhaps a necessary evil, the harsh medicine required to cure a gravely ill patient, but harsh nonetheless. And this, then, was the sin of selective memory. Horemheb carefully crafted his own version of history, presenting himself as the legitimate successor to Amenhotep III, skipping over the entire Amarna period as if it were a bad dream. He dated his reign from Amenhotep III's death, essentially retroactively erasing Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and I from the king lists. He literally wrote himself into the grand narrative, ensuring his place as the savior of Egypt rather than the general who seized the crown. It's a masterful piece of historical revisionism, a testament to the power of narrative control, and a reminder that history is often written by the victors, and sometimes those victors even get to choose who the previous victors were. Out of the ashes of the Amarna chaos and Horemheb's brutal restoration, a new dynasty arose, one that would redefine pharaonic glory, bombast, and arguably sin on an epic scale. This was the 19th dynasty, the beginning of the Ramesside Age, spearheaded by Seti I. He inherited Horemheb's work, consolidating the reforms and reestablishing order, but with a renewed, almost aggressive focus on military might. The message was clear. Egypt was back, and it was flexing its considerable muscles. Seti I understood that a strong Egypt was one that projected power beyond its borders. The sin here, then, is one of constant warfare, of aggressive militarism justified as necessary defense. His campaigns against the Hittites, Libyans, and various other Near Eastern peoples were not merely defensive skirmishes. They were deliberate acts of imperial expansion designed to reassert Egyptian dominance and secure valuable trade routes and resources. Imagine a king who genuinely believed that peace was merely the interval between wars, and that the only way to ensure security was to constantly demonstrate overwhelming force. This was Seti I, carving his victories in stone, quite literally, on the walls of Karnak Temple. But Seti I wasn't just a warrior king, he was also a master of monumental propaganda. His lavish temple at Abydos, dedicated to Osiris and the cult of the ancestral kings, is a breathtaking masterpiece of carved reliefs and vibrant colors. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was a massive propaganda piece designed to reestablish religious authority after the Amarna heresy and to firmly legitimize his own rule by connecting himself to the glorious past. Every relief depicting him making offerings to the gods, every intricate scene of divine interaction, was a powerful visual affirmation of his piety and his undeniable right to rule. The sin here is not just vanity, but the strategic deployment of religious art to manipulate public perception and consolidate power. And so, Seti I, the warrior and the builder, meticulously set the stage for his even more famous and, arguably, even more sinful son. He solidified Egypt's position as a regional superpower, rebuilt its religious institutions, and created a legacy of military prowess and artistic grandeur. But his constant warfare, his appropriation of resources for monumental projects, and his self-aggrandizing propaganda were all variations on familiar pharaonic sins, merely executed with greater finesse and on a grander scale. He was the opening act for the ultimate showman, a pharaoh whose ego would eclipse all others, a man whose name would become synonymous with ancient Egyptian might and monumental excess. Get ready for Ramesses II. All right, buckle up, Buttercup, because we're about to dive headfirst into the reign of Ramesses II, arguably the most audacious, self-aggrandizing, and utterly ubiquitous pharaoh in Egyptian history. This was a man who truly believed he was the main character, and he made damn sure everyone else knew it too. His fundamental sin was one of colossal self-aggrandizement, a megalomania so pervasive that his name is quite literally everywhere. If you stub your toe on a loose brick in Egypt, chances are Ramesses II put his name on it. He wasn't just building monuments, he was building a brand, his brand. Take Abu Simbel, for instance. Those massive, breathtaking temples carved into the sandstone cliffs of Nubia are ostensibly dedicated to the gods Amun, Ra-Horakhti, and Ptah. But let's be honest, who's really the star of the show? 4 colossal statues of Ramesses II himself, dwarfing the very deities they're meant to honor. The temple's inner sanctuary is strategically aligned so that twice a year, the sun's rays penetrate deep inside, illuminating the statues of the gods, and, conveniently, one of Ramesses II. It's a monument not just to the gods, but explicitly to Ramesses himself, a cosmic spotlight ensuring his divine connection was literal and undeniable. The sin here is appropriating divine reverence for personal glorification, turning worship into a marketing campaign for one's own ego. Then there's the Battle of Kadesh, a military encounter against the Hittites that, by all accounts, was a strategic stalemate. Ramesses II nearly lost his life. His forces were almost annihilated, and the outcome was, at best, a draw. But did that stop him from spinning it into the most glorious, earth-shattering victory ever conceived? Absolutely not. He plastered the narrative of his heroic, single-handed triumph on the walls of no less than 5 major temples. He depicted himself as a fearless warrior, personally driving his chariot into the fray, turning the tide against impossible odds. It was a masterful piece of propaganda, a spin campaign worthy of a modern political consultant, turning a near disaster into a legendary triumph. The sin here is the blatant, unapologetic revisionism of history, reshaping inconvenient truths into self-serving myths. His reign was characterized by an endless proliferation of statuary and colossal monuments. Everywhere you looked, there was Ramesses. Colossal statues of him stood guard at temples. His cartouches were carved into every available surface, and entire cities were built in his honor. It was an attempt to ensure eternal fame, to leave an indelible mark on the landscape and the collective consciousness of Egypt. He understood that in a world without photographs or mass media, sheer, overwhelming physical presence was the key to immortality. The sin is the sheer, unbridled arrogance of it all, the belief that one man's image could and should dominate the visual landscape of an entire civilization. Ramesses II wasn't just a pharaoh. He was a walking, talking, perpetually self-replicating monument to himself, and he loved every moment of it. If Ramesses II was a master of self-aggrandizement, he was also a master of another very pharaonic sin, profligacy. Specifically, when it came to procreation. This man wasn't just building temples. He was building a family tree that branched into a veritable forest. We're talking more than 100 children, and possibly up to 200. A number so unimaginable it makes King Henry VIII look like a monogamous introvert. His harem was vast, a testament to his vigor, his divine potency, and his absolute disregard for any concept of family planning. The sin here is sheer, unadulterated excess, treating human life as a resource to be generated for dynastic security and personal legacy. Queen Nefertari was his most beloved chief wife, the one for all time, immortalized in the stunning smaller temple at Abu Simbel, where she's depicted almost as large as her colossal husband, a rare honor. She was beautiful, intelligent, and held significant influence, often appearing at his side. But even the most beloved was still one of many. Ramesses II maintained a sprawling harem filled with secondary wives, concubines, and royal princesses, all vying for attention, influence, and the chance to bear a prince. Nefertari might have been the queen, but she was still a queen in a very crowded kingdom of women. The sheer number of his children raises a dark, humorous question: the sin of neglect? How could one father truly know, let alone adequately parent, so many children? Imagine the annual birthday party, the Christmas shopping list. The royal family must have been less a family and more a small, highly competitive village. Most of his children would have been raised by tutors, wet nurses, and secondary wives. Their contact with their divine father probably limited to ceremonial appearances. It's a poignant contrast, a pharaoh who built monuments to his eternal fame, but perhaps struggled to remember the names of all his offspring. The sin of impersonal parenthood, where children are produced as assets rather than nurtured as individuals. And then there were the political marriages. Ramesses II, despite his formidable military might, was also a pragmatist. He famously married Hittite princesses as part of peace treaties, cementing alliances with his former enemies. These weren't unions of love. They were cold, calculated political maneuvers designed to secure peace and stability. Was love ever a factor in these unions? Almost certainly not. These foreign princesses were pawns in a geopolitical game, far from their homes, thrust into a foreign court and a vastly overcrowded harem. The sin here is the commodification of women for political ends, reducing individuals to diplomatic tools. Ramesses II was a man of immense power, and he used every aspect of his life, from his wars to his marriages, to consolidate and celebrate that power, often with very little regard for the human cost. Ramesses II wasn't content just to rule and procreate. He wanted to reinvent Egypt in his own image. This led to the creation of Pi-Ramesses, his brand new capital city in the eastern delta. It was a massive undertaking, a city built from scratch, complete with temples, palaces, administrative buildings, and military barracks. Imagine building a modern metropolis overnight, redirecting vast resources, labor, and talent from all corners of the empire. It was an astonishing feat, but also another sin of monumental economic drain, diverting funds and manpower from other potentially more pressing needs, simply to create a new, grand seat for his magnificent self. The sin of a long reign. Ramesses II sat on the throne for an astonishing 66 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. While this provided stability, it also had its drawbacks. He outlived many of his children, including his numerous designated heirs, leading to a succession crisis that eventually saw his 13th son, Merneptah, finally take the crown at an advanced age. A reign of such extraordinary length can lead to stagnation, as innovation is stifled by entrenched bureaucracy and the unwavering will of one man. It can also lead to widespread corruption, as officials grow comfortable in their positions and consolidate power over decades. The very stability he provided might have inadvertently sown the seeds of later decline. The potential for corruption and stagnation when a ruler reigns too long is a subtle but pervasive sin. With the pharaoh on the throne for over half a century, the administrative machinery could become ossified. Officials grew old in their posts, nepotism flourished, and new ideas found it difficult to penetrate the rigid layers of an aging bureaucracy. The empire, though seemingly strong, might have slowly begun to fray at the edges, its vitality sapped by the sheer longevity of its supreme leader. Ramesses II's enduring presence, while impressive, might have inadvertently created a political bottleneck, preventing necessary renewal and adaptation. And finally, his eventual mummy. The man who was a living god, the embodiment of power and virility, the builder of colossal monuments, reduced to a fragile, desiccated husk, now residing in a glass case in a museum. It's a poignant, darkly comedic contrast to the living god he once was. All the wealth, all the power, all the propaganda, ultimately culminated in this. A silent, shriveled reminder of mortality. The sin of seeking immortality through earthly means, only to find it in the most ironically perishable form. Ramesses II wanted to live forever, and in a way, he did, but not quite in the way he envisioned. His mummy stands as a quiet testament to the ultimate futility of even the grandest pharaonic ambitions. Imagine being the son of Ramesses II, the most famous, most bombastic, most everything pharaoh in Egyptian history. Now, imagine waiting 60-plus years for your turn on the throne, watching all your elder brothers die off one by one, only to finally become pharaoh when you're already an old man, probably with a bad back and a serious case of exhaustion. This was Merneptah's fate, and his immediate sin was simply one of waiting. He inherited not a vibrant, fresh empire, but a used one. An empire already showing signs of wear and tear after his father's incredibly long, incredibly demanding reign. It's like inheriting a classic car that's still beautiful, but definitely needs some serious work under the hood. Merneptah didn't have the luxury of basking in his father's reflected glory. He immediately had to deal with a new, terrifying threat to Egypt's borders, the Sea Peoples. These mysterious maritime raiders, a confederation of various ethnic groups, were destabilizing the entire eastern Mediterranean, toppling empires left and right, Merneptah found himself embroiled in brutal defensive wars against these invaders, fighting for the very survival of Egypt. He had to be a warrior, not just a builder of monuments. The sin here is not his, but rather the cosmic injustice of having to clean up everyone else's mess, inheriting a world far more dangerous and complex than the one his father had so confidently dominated. And then, a small yet profoundly significant detail on his famous Israel stele. Amidst a long list of conquered peoples and pacified lands, Merneptah boasts of campaigning against a people called Israel. This is the first extra-biblical mention of Israel in history, a tiny inscription that launched 1,000 scholarly debates. For our purposes, it's a reminder that Merneptah, despite his defensive struggles, was still a pharaoh engaged in the sin of conquest, expanding or at least maintaining Egypt's imperial reach through military force. He was a product of his time, a ruler who understood that power meant projection, even if his heart was probably yearning for a quiet retirement. The burden of living up to a legendary father is often a sin in itself. Merneptah constantly had to contend with the shadow of Ramesses the Great. He couldn't outbuild him, couldn't outconquer him, couldn't outprocreate him. His reign, while militarily successful and administratively solid, would always be viewed through the lens of his father's unparalleled achievements. He was good, but not great in the way his father was great. It's the eternal curse of the second generation, always compared, rarely truly appreciated on their own merits. Merneptah was a competent, necessary pharaoh, but his story remains one of quiet competence, overshadowed by the magnificent, booming ego of his predecessor. A life spent in the wings, finally getting the spotlight, only to find it's a bit too dim. Fast forward a few decades, past a succession of increasingly weak and short-lived pharaohs bearing the name Ramesses, and we arrive at Ramesses III. He represents a brief resurgence of pharaonic power, a last gasp of new kingdom glory before the empire's final, slow decline. He fought off multiple waves of sea peoples, those persistent maritime raiders, built impressive temples, and tried to recapture the magic of Ramesses II. But the cracks were showing. The resources were scarcer, the internal strife more potent, and the divine right felt a little less divine. He was a man trying to hold back the tide with a very elaborate, but ultimately porous, sieve. And then the ultimate sin of internal strife, the infamous harem conspiracy. This wasn't some minor palace intrigue. This was a full-blown plot to assassinate the pharaoh himself. Imagine the security breach, the sheer audacity of planning a regicide within the supposedly sacred confines of the royal palace. It exposed the deep rot within the pharaonic system, the festering resentments, and the naked ambition that even a strong pharaoh like Ramesses III couldn't completely suppress. It was a dramatic, darkly comedic explosion of courtly backstabbing, a stark reminder that even living gods had enemies much closer than they thought. At the heart of this conspiracy were Ta, not the previous one, but a secondary wife of Ramesses III, and her son Pentaweret. Ta desperately wanted her son on the throne, rather than the designated heir, the future Ramesses IV. So, like any good, ambitious mother in ancient Egypt, she decided to plot the assassination of her husband. She recruited a network of court officials, harem overseers, and even foreign mercenaries. It was a classic tale of maternal ambition mixed with royal entitlement, proving that, even in the land of the divine, a mother's love, or lust for power, could be a terrifying force. Their sin was treason, pure and simple, but also a desperate gamble for ultimate power. The grisly details of the assassination attempt are quite something. Ramesses III was indeed killed, his throat slashed, a toe amputated, and his private parts mutilated, according to forensic evidence on his mummy. It was a brutal, personal attack, suggesting a deep level of hatred and a desire to ensure his eternal suffering. The plot involved not just violence, but also black magic, with conspirators using waxen figurines and spells to try and paralyze the pharaoh and his guards. It's a dark reflection of royal jealousy and ambition, a chilling testament to the lengths people would go to seize power, even if it meant defying divine authority and resorting to the most heinous acts imaginable. Ramesses III might have defeated foreign enemies, but he couldn't defeat the enemies within his own bedchamber. The harem conspiracy wasn't just a brutal assassination, it was followed by an equally dramatic and unprecedented trial. We know about this because of the extraordinary judicial papyrus, a document that meticulously details the accusations, the interrogations, and the gruesome punishments meted out to the conspirators. Imagine a modern court transcript, but instead of mundane legal jargon, it's filled with details of black magic, forced suicides, and the very specific ways one's nose might be cut off. It's a chillingly intimate glimpse into the dark heart of royal justice. The trial also exposed the deep sin of corruption within the court itself. It wasn't just a few disgruntled harem women. High-ranking officials, royal cupbearers, scribes, and even judges were implicated in the conspiracy. This wasn't just a coup attempt. It was a systemic failure, a revelation that the very pillars of pharaonic power were compromised. The fact that judges were involved suggests a desperate scramble for power, a breakdown of loyalty, and a fundamental questioning of the divine right of the reigning pharaoh. It's a dark comedy of errors, where everyone, from the lowestly servant to the highest magistrate, seemed to be in on the plot. And the punishments? Oh, they were suitably gruesome, a stark reminder that ancient Egyptian justice operated on a very different moral compass than our own. Many conspirators were forced to commit suicide, others were mutilated, noses and ears cut off, branded with hot irons, and then publicly executed. Their names were erased from records, condemning them to eternal oblivion, a truly terrifying prospect for an Egyptian. The chief instigators, including Taye and Pentaweret, were naturally among the first to face the full, bloody wrath of the state. It was a horrifying spectacle, designed not just to punish, but to send an unequivocal message about the consequences of treason. This dark end to a powerful reign, exposing the rot within the system, was a harbinger of things to come. The harem conspiracy wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of deeper institutional decay. It showed that even the most formidable pharaohs were vulnerable, that loyalty could be bought or twisted, and that the divine right could be challenged from within. It was a moment of profound vulnerability for the pharaonic institution, a crack in the gilded facade that would slowly, inexorably widen over the coming decades, leading to the ultimate demise of the new kingdom's glory. The pharaohs might have been gods, but their human ambitions and frailties ultimately proved to be their downfall. After the dramatic fireworks of Ramesses III's assassination, the Ramesside age didn't exactly go out with a bang, more like a long, drawn-out whimper. The subsequent Ramesside pharaohs, all named Ramesses because apparently originality was a sin in itself, were increasingly weak, ineffective, and overshadowed by the lingering crises of the empire. Imagine a long-running TV series that's clearly past its prime, churning out increasingly bland episodes with characters you barely recognize. That was the late Ramesside period, a slow, agonizing slide into decline. One of the most telling sins of this period was rampant tomb robbery. Imagine being so desperate, so utterly lacking in faith in the state, that you would desecrate the sacred resting places of pharaohs and nobles. This wasn't just petty theft, it was the ultimate sin of sacrilege, a direct challenge to the very concept of divine protection and eternal life. The elaborate security systems, the curses, the hidden passages, all were rendered useless by the desperate need for gold and valuables. It was a sign of widespread economic hardship, administrative breakdown, and a profound loss of respect for the divine authority that once commanded absolute reverence. The gods, it seemed, couldn't even protect their own dead. And speaking of widespread discontent, this period saw unprecedented strikes by necropolis workers, the very artisans who carved and decorated the royal tombs. Imagine the guys responsible for ensuring your immortal afterlife suddenly downing tools because they hadn't been paid or fed in months. This was a direct, undeniable sign of widespread discontent and poverty. It showed that even the essential workers of the divine kingdom were fed up, challenging the pharaoh's authority through collective action. It's a darkly humorous image, the workers of the afterlife, protesting their very earthly conditions. The sin here is not just poverty, but the systemic neglect that drove people to such desperate measures. The most profound sin of this period was the slow, inevitable loss of empire. Egypt, once the undisputed superpower, began retracting into its own borders, a mere shadow of its former self. Nubia gained independence, the territories in the Near East were lost, and the flow of tribute dried up. The pharaohs could no longer project their power. Their divine right no longer extended beyond the Nile Valley. It was a period of contraction, of diminished expectations, of watching a once great empire slowly but surely unravel. The sin here is not an active transgression, but the passive failure to maintain what previous generations had built, a testament to the corrosive effects of internal decay and a lack of central vision. If you thought the first intermediate period was messy, prepare for its even messier, more prolonged sequel, the third intermediate period. This was Egypt's equivalent of a particularly painful breakup, followed by a series of increasingly questionable rebound relationships. The central authority completely collapsed, giving way to an era of profound fragmentation and, you guessed it, foreign rule. Again, the sin here, once more, is the ultimate failing for any pharaonic system, losing control of their own sacred land. First came the Libyan pharaohs, then the Nubian pharaohs. These weren't conquering hordes in the Hyksos style. These were often powerful military leaders or tribal chiefs who had gradually assimilated into Egyptian culture but retained their foreign identities. They simply stepped into the power vacuum, seizing the crown when native Egyptians were too weak or disunited to hold on to it. Was their rule a sin of foreign occupation? From a nationalist Egyptian perspective, absolutely. From a purely pragmatic viewpoint, perhaps they offered a semblance of stability. But for the average Egyptian, it meant yet another layer of overlords, another set of customs, another reminder that their divine native rulers couldn't quite get their act together. Compounding this fragmentation was the rise of the high priests of Amun at Thebes. Remember those guys Akhenaten tried to get rid of? Well, they're back, and with a vengeance. During this period, they accumulated immense power, effectively becoming a rival dynasty, ruling Upper Egypt almost independently of the pharaohs in the Delta. Imagine the Pope suddenly declaring himself emperor of half of Italy, independently of the actual king. This accumulation of spiritual and temporal power was a significant sin against the centralized pharaonic ideal, creating a schism that further weakened the nation. It was a two-headed monster, both heads vying for control, leaving the body of Egypt in disarray. The result was the fragmentation of Egypt into competing mini-states. You had the Tanite pharaohs in the Delta, the high priests of Amun in Thebes, and various local strongmen carving out their own spheres of influence. It was less a unified kingdom and more a collection of squabbling city-states, each with its own agenda, each claiming a piece of the divine pie. The cycle of sin repeated itself like a historical broken record. Power struggles, corruption, lack of centralized vision, all contributing to the decline of a once great civilization. It's the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when everyone wants to be a god, but no one wants to actually rule. Just when you thought Egypt was destined to be a permanent hot mess, help arrived from an unexpected quarter, the south. Enter the Nubian dynasty, the pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, rulers like Pianki and Taharka, who emerged from the ancient kingdom of Kush, modern-day Sudan. These weren't your typical foreign invaders. They were deeply pious, devout admirers of traditional Egyptian culture and religion. They saw themselves not as conquerors, but as restorers, intent on bringing back the glory days and purifying Egypt of its decadence. Imagine your slightly overbearing, religiously zealous cousin coming to stay and reorganizing your entire life. That was the Nubian takeover. So, was their rule a sin of foreign occupation? From a strict Egyptian nationalist perspective, yes, they were still foreign kings sitting on the throne of the pharaohs, but their intentions were genuinely different. They revered the old gods, particularly Amun, and embarked on massive building projects in a distinctly archaizing style, deliberately copying the art and architecture of the Old Kingdom. They sought to restore traditional Egyptian values, bringing a much-needed injection of piety and purpose to a land that had lost its way. Their sin, if any, was perhaps a cultural appropriation with good intentions, a benevolent takeover driven by deep respect rather than pure conquest. But piety, even when genuine, rarely comes without a healthy dose of power politics. The Nubians, for all their reverence, were still rulers, and they pursued their own imperial ambitions. Their rule brought them into direct conflict with the burgeoning Assyrian Empire, a truly terrifying military juggernaut of the Near East. This wasn't a skirmish, it was a clash of empires, a showdown between ancient might and modern, for the time, military technology. The result, tragically for Egypt and Nubia, was defeat. The Assyrians sacked Thebes, dealt devastating blows, and ultimately forced the Nubians to retreat back to their southern homeland. The sin here is perhaps the strategic blunder of taking on an opponent too powerful, even for a divinely inspired king. Despite the Assyrian defeat, the Nubian period was a brief, culturally rich time for Egypt. It saw a revival of monumental architecture, a renewed emphasis on religious orthodoxy, and a fascinating blend of Egyptian and Nubian cultural elements. It was a final, vibrant flicker before the ultimate darkness. But ultimately, their earnest attempts to halt the decline were unsuccessful. The geopolitical landscape was shifting too dramatically, and even the most pious, well-intentioned foreign pharaohs couldn't stem the tide of imperial expansion from other, more ruthless powers. The Nubians gave it their best shot, but Egypt's days of independent pharaohic glory were numbered, and even their sins were tinged with a certain tragic nobility. After the dust settled from the Assyrian invasion and the Nubian retreat, Egypt found itself under the rule of the Site dynasty, the 26th dynasty. Led by pharaohs like Psamtik I, they managed to unify Egypt once more, trying desperately to recapture the lost glory of the Old Kingdom. Imagine a band of hopeful historical LARPers trying to recreate the good old days, complete with meticulously researched costumes and a renewed enthusiasm for ancient traditions. It was a moment of fleeting resurgence, a final fading glory before the inevitable Roman sunset. The primary sin of the Saite Renaissance was perhaps one of looking backward. They weren't forging a new path, they were meticulously trying to revive past greatness. They copied Old Kingdom art styles, adopted ancient titles, and revived archaic religious practices. It was a desperate attempt to rewind the clock, to invoke the power of a bygone era in the hope of escaping the harsh realities of their present. While admirable in its ambition, it was ultimately unsustainable. History, as it turns out, is a relentless forward march, and clinging too tightly to the past can leave you vulnerable to the future. It's the sin of nostalgia, elevated to state policy. To protect their newly unified but still fragile kingdom, the Site pharaohs increasingly relied on mercenary armies. Greek, Carian, and other foreign fighters swelled their ranks, providing the military muscle that native Egyptians could no longer consistently supply. Imagine a sovereign nation relying almost entirely on outsourced security. It was a pragmatic necessity, but it also represented a profound sin of weakness and reliance on outsiders. It meant that Egypt's defense was literally in the hands of foreigners, creating a complex web of dependencies and potential vulnerabilities. It's like owning a house, but having to hire an army of professional bouncers just to keep the front door secure. This period saw a brief economic prosperity, fueled by trade with the Mediterranean world, and a period of relative peace. But the geopolitical landscape was shifting dramatically. The Assyrian Empire declined, only to be replaced by the even more formidable Babylonian and then Persian empires. Egypt, though seemingly revitalized, was caught between colossal forces, a pawn in a much larger game. The Saitide pharaohs, for all their efforts, were simply delaying the inevitable. Their sins were perhaps less about personal malevolence and more about the tragic limitations of power in a rapidly changing world, a final, poignant attempt to cling to an age that was rapidly drawing to a close. And so, the inevitable arrived. After centuries of internal strife, foreign rule, and desperate attempts at revival, Egypt finally fell to the might of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Enter Cambyses II, the Persian emperor who conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, effectively ending 3,000 years of independent pharaonic rule. Imagine the shock, the humiliation. The land of the gods, now just another satrapy in a vast, sprawling empire. The sin here is clear and unambiguous. The brutal reality of imperialism, of one power simply swallowing another whole. Cambyses II is often portrayed by Egyptian sources as a cruel, mad king given to acts of desecration and disrespect towards Egyptian traditions. He allegedly mocked their gods, killed their sacred Apis bull, and raided their temples. While some of these accounts might be propaganda designed to demonize the conqueror, it's clear that the Persian conquest was a profoundly traumatic experience for the Egyptians. The sin of desecration, of disrespecting local deities and customs, was perhaps the greatest affront to the deeply religious Egyptians. It was a direct attack on their cosmic order, a challenge to the very fabric of their belief system. Darius I, who succeeded Cambyses, adopted a more pragmatic approach. He recognized the value of Egyptian administration and tradition, styling himself as a pharaoh and respecting local customs. He completed a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea and supported local temples. But make no mistake, he was still a foreign overlord, governing Egypt from afar. The sin of foreign rule, even a benevolent one, remained. Egypt was no longer its own master. Its resources, its labor, its destiny were dictated by a distant emperor in Persepolis. Egypt became a satrapy, a province of the vast Persian Empire, governed by a Persian satrap. The end of independent pharaonic rule was effectively complete, not for a few decades, but for centuries. While there would be periods of rebellion and temporary independence, the era of truly sovereign, self-determined pharaohs was over. The sins of imperialism, of conquest and subjugation, had finally caught up with Egypt, turning the once mighty empire into a mere breadbasket for a larger, more formidable power. It's a sobering end to a long, often glorious, often brutal, and always utterly self-obsessed era of divine kingship. Just when Egypt thought it couldn't get any more complicated, along came Alexander the Great, sweeping through the ancient world like a particularly zealous tour guide. His conquest in 332 BCE wasn't just a change of leadership, it was the beginning of a whole new, utterly bizarre era, the Ptolemaic dynasty. Imagine a bunch of highly cultured, immensely ambitious Greek generals deciding, you know what, this pharaoh thing looks fun. Let's give it a whirl. And thus, a line of Greek rulers began to wear the double crown. Ptolemy I Soter, Alexander's general, founded the dynasty, establishing a line of rulers who were Macedonian Greeks, not Egyptians. They adopted pharaonic titles, built Egyptian-style temples, and even depicted themselves in traditional Egyptian attire in their monuments. But they spoke Greek, governed in Greek, and often treated the native Egyptians as a subject populace. The sin here is a masterclass in cultural appropriation, adopting the symbols and rituals of a conquered people to legitimize foreign rule. It was a brilliant, cynical move, designed to appease the Egyptian populace while maintaining a distinctly Greek elite. And the Ptolemaic sins? Oh, they were a glorious return to classic pharaonic form with a distinct Greek twist. Incest, for example, was back with a vengeance. But this time it was justified not by Egyptian divine tradition, but by Greek custom. Marrying siblings was common among Hellenistic royalty to maintain bloodline purity and consolidate power. Ptolemaic family trees are a tangled mess of sibling marriages. a testament to their dedication to dynastic exclusivity. And then there was the fratricide. So much fratricide. And sororicide. And parricide. The Ptolemaic court was a hotbed of political intrigue, poisonings, assassinations, and constant power struggles within the family. It was less a royal family and more a particularly violent episode of succession. Imagine brothers killing brothers, sisters poisoning sisters, all for the gleaming prize of the Egyptian throne. Their sins were not just personal vices. They were a systemic feature of their rule, a brutal dance of power that ensured only the most ruthless survived. While they built grand cities like Alexandria, filled with libraries and scholars, their personal lives were a testament to the corrosive effects of absolute power, ancient DNA mingling with Greek ambition to create a dynasty steeped in blood, betrayal, and a very peculiar form of cultural mimicry. They might have worn the pharaonic crown, but their hearts beat with a distinctly Hellenistic and deeply sinful pulse. And now, for the grand finale, the most famous, most iconic, and perhaps most sinful pharaoh of them all, Cleopatra VII. Her legend eclipses almost all others, a woman whose name alone conjures images of power, beauty, and seductive allure. But beneath the glittering facade of myth lay a ruthless, brilliant, and utterly pragmatic ruler fighting for the survival of her dynasty and her country. Her sins were often born of necessity, tempered by ambition, and always executed with a theatrical flourish. Her sins of ambition began early, with the ruthless elimination of her siblings. She famously had her younger sister Arsinoe IV murdered, and possibly orchestrated the deaths of her brothers Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. This wasn't some minor sibling squabble. This was cold, calculated political murder, designed to eliminate rivals and consolidate her hold on the throne. In the cutthroat world of Ptolemaic politics, where fratricide was practically a family sport, these acts were perhaps necessary for survival. But by our standards, they are undeniably dark, a testament to the lengths she would go to secure her power. And then her legendary sin of manipulating powerful Roman men. Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not just her lovers. They were her pawns, her protectors, her tickets to retaining Egypt's independence. She famously had herself delivered to Caesar in a rolled-up carpet, a dramatic entrance designed to captivate and disarm. With Antony, it was a grand love affair, but also a strategic alliance, leveraging Roman power to secure her position. Was she truly in love, or was it all a carefully choreographed performance? Probably both, in a complex dance of passion and politics. Her sin was turning her charisma and intelligence into a weapon, using her charm as a strategic tool to bend the most powerful men in the world to her will. Cleopatra's legendary charisma and intelligence were not just for show. They were deployed with pinpoint accuracy to protect Egypt and herself from being swallowed by the ever-expanding Roman Republic. She was a polyglot, a skilled administrator, and a shrewd diplomat, capable of conversing with any foreign envoy in their own language. She understood that Egypt's survival depended on playing the Roman game, navigating the treacherous waters of Roman civil wars, and choosing the right Roman strongmen to back. Her sins were the price of survival, the necessary evils committed by a queen fighting a desperate, losing battle against the inexorable march of history. She was a force of nature, a queen who refused to go gently into that good Roman night. Cleopatra's story, like all good tragedies, culminates in a fatal flaw. For her, it was arguably the sin of mixing love and politics, an entanglement that ultimately led to her downfall. Her passionate, undeniable affair with Mark Antony, one of the triumvirs of Rome, was a spectacular, very public display of power and affection. But in the ruthless world of Roman politics, such an alliance was seen as a dangerous threat, a betrayal of Roman values, and an affront to the ambitious Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. Her heart, or perhaps her strategic mind, led her to stake everything on Antony, a gamble that would prove catastrophic. The disastrous Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was the beginning of the end. A naval battle off the coast of Greece, it saw Octavian's forces utterly defeat the combined fleets of Antony and Cleopatra. It was a strategic blunder, a military catastrophe that sealed their fate. Cleopatra, seeing the battle turning against them, famously fled with her ships, followed by Antony. It was an act that forever stained their legacy, depicting them as cowardly lovers abandoning their troops. The sin here is not just military defeat, but the compounding moral failure of perceived desertion, a loss of face that would prove impossible to recover from. With Octavian's legions closing in on Egypt, the game was up. Antony, defeated and disgraced, committed suicide. Cleopatra, ever the queen of dramatic flair, attempted to negotiate with Octavian, possibly even trying to seduce him, but he was immune to her charms. Facing the humiliation of being paraded as a captive in a Roman triumph, she chose a different path, her dramatic suicide. The traditional story, of course, involves an asp smuggled in a basket of figs, a final, symbolic act of defiance against Roman subjugation. It was a final, spectacular sin of pride, choosing death over dishonor, preserving her legend even as her kingdom crumbled. And so, with Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, the sun finally set on pharaonic Egypt. 3 millennia of divine rule, of monumental egos, of incest, intrigue, and relentless power struggles came to a tragic, cinematic conclusion. Egypt, once the master of its own destiny, became a Roman province, ruled by a Roman emperor. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, stood as a symbol of both the glorious power and the ultimate futility of the pharaonic ideal, a queen whose sins were inextricably woven into the fabric of her desperate struggle for survival. It's a story so dramatic, so filled with passion and tragedy, it almost makes you forget all the boring, sleep-inducing bits we covered earlier. Almost. And so, the curtains close on the independent pharaohs. With Cleopatra's dramatic exit, Egypt became merely a province of the Roman Empire, a personal possession of the emperor. Yet, in a bizarre twist of cultural appropriation, the Roman emperors, from Augustus onwards, still allowed themselves to be depicted as pharaohs on Egyptian temples. Imagine Julius Caesar's great-nephew, Octavian, now styled as Augustus, appearing in hieroglyphs, wearing the double crown, making offerings to Egyptian gods. It was a title without true power, a superficial nod to local tradition, designed to maintain order and extract resources rather than embody genuine divinity. This was the sin of absentee rule. Egypt was now governed from Rome. Its wealth and its prodigious agricultural output, particularly grain, flowing directly into the Roman coffers. It was reduced to the breadbasket of Rome, a vital economic engine for the vast empire, but utterly devoid of its own political agency. The Roman governors, prefects, and administrators replaced the pharaoh's court, wielding true power, while the pharaoh in Rome was a distant, often uninterested figure. The nuanced interplay of divine right and local politics was gone, replaced by the cold, hard logic of imperial administration. Under Roman influence, the slow death of traditional Egyptian religion began. While the Romans tolerated and even occasionally patronized Egyptian temples, the vitality and central importance of the old gods gradually waned. The cults of Isis and Osiris would endure, even spreading throughout the Roman Empire, but they were no longer the state-sponsored, omnipresent force they once were. The priests lost their power, the temples became tourist attractions rather than centers of political influence, and the cosmic order of Ma'at slowly faded into obscurity. The sin here is the gradual, often unintentional, erosion of a culture under the weight of foreign dominance. The pharaonic concept, once the very bedrock of Egyptian civilization, underwent a final, quiet fading. The grand temples continued to be built, often with Roman emperors depicted as traditional pharaohs, right up until the 4th century CE. But it was an empty gesture, a hollow echo of a glorious past. The living god was now a distant emperor, uninterested in the nuances of Egyptian theology, focused instead on tax revenue and grain shipments. The finality of this moment is profound. The pharaonic institution, which had endured for 3 millennia, finally succumbed not to a sudden, dramatic collapse, but to a slow, almost imperceptible obsolescence. The sins of the pharaohs, once so potent and impactful, were now just footnotes in a much larger imperial story. Well, you made it. You've navigated 3 millennia of ego, excess, and occasionally incest. Congratulations. Now, let's recap the highlights of the pharaonic sins we've endured. We've seen incest, from the subtle beginnings to the Ptolemaic fratricidal free-for-all. We've witnessed excess on a scale that makes modern billionaires look like penny pinchers. Monumental pyramids, opulent palaces, and enough gold to make the sun jealous. There was the constant exploitation of the common people, whose labor and lives were currency for divine ambition. We delved into religious tyranny, from Akhenaten's monotheistic purge to the priests' power plays. Militarism was a recurring theme, driven by expansion and the insatiable quest for resources. And, of course, the ever-present megalomania, the unshakable belief that one man was literally a god, and everyone else was just there to serve his divine whims. The enduring power of the pharaonic image is fascinating, isn't it? Despite its dark undercurrents, its inherent brutality, and its monumental cost in human suffering, the image of the pharaoh persists as a symbol of ancient glory, of mystique, of unparalleled power. We see the golden masks, the soaring pyramids, and we forget the exploitation, the endless toil, the casual cruelty that built them. The glitter overshadows the grime. The myth eclipses the messy reality. It's a testament to the power of effective propaganda, a 3,000-year-old PR campaign that still works. And that's the thing, isn't it? The truly messed up reality isn't found in the grand heroic narratives, but in the boring details, the administrative papyri, the casual brutality of a system built on unchecked power. It's in the strike notes of necropolis workers, the detailed accounts of harem conspiracies, the medical reports of inbred kings. These are the mundane, often overlooked facts that peel back the layers of divine grandeur and reveal the profoundly human, and often profoundly inhumane, underbelly of pharaonic rule. The sleep aid wasn't just a gimmick, it was the mechanism to show you the truth, one detail at a time. The thin line between divine ruler and absolute dictator was, for the pharaohs, essentially non-existent. They blurred the boundaries so effectively that they ceased to exist. They were divine because they were absolute. They were absolute because they were divine. It was a perfect, self-reinforcing circle of power, accountability-free, and utterly irresistible. Their sins were not just personal failings, but systemic consequences of a political theology that placed one man above all law, all morality, and all humanity. It was a testament to the intoxicating allure of absolute power and the terrifying ways it can corrupt, even a supposedly divine soul. So, after this epic, sleep-inducing journey through the valleys of pharaonic vice, we arrive at the million-dollar question. Did they know they were sinning? Did Ramesses II, basking in the glow of his own colossal statues, ever have a moment of quiet introspection? A nagging thought that perhaps, just perhaps, building yet another temple to himself might be a bit much? Probably not. The relativistic nature of sin is crucial here. Were they truly evil in their own context? Or simply products of their time, operating within a moral framework we find utterly alien? It's a delightful thought experiment, isn't it? Perhaps their version of sin was simply not building enough monuments, or allowing the Nile to flood insufficiently. Our modern judgment, of course, is inescapable. We apply our values of human rights, equality, and basic decency to an ancient world that had none of them. We cringe at the incest, recoil at the exploitation, and scoff at the divine pretensions. But perhaps that's the point. History isn't just about understanding the past, it's about holding a mirror to our own present, understanding the timeless allure of power and the timeless ways it corrupts. To truly grasp the sins of the pharaohs, we have to acknowledge that the capacity for such hubris, such cruelty, still lurks within the human heart, waiting for the right opportunity to don a golden crown. Yet, despite, or perhaps precisely because of their flaws, their stories endure. The enduring appeal of the pharaohs, these magnificent, monstrous figures, lies in their sheer, unadulterated humanity, ironically masked by their claims of divinity. They were petty, vain, ruthless, and utterly fascinating. Their stories are a testament to the human capacity for both greatness and utter depravity, a grand theatrical display of all that is wrong and perversely compelling about absolute power. We are drawn to them, not just for the gold, but for the drama, the sheer audacity of their lives, and the dark humor of their divine delusions. So here's a final, cynical thought on power, human nature, and the long, sleep-inducing march of history. Power, especially absolute power, doesn't corrupt. It simply reveals. It strips away the pretense, the politeness, the carefully constructed facade of decency, and lays bare the true, often terrifying, core of human ambition. The pharaohs were just the ultimate test subjects in this grand experiment, given free rein to indulge every whim, and they did so with spectacular, often sinful results. They were our ancient reality TV stars, living out their dramas on a colossal stage. And we, millennia later, are still watching, horrified, amused, and perhaps a little bit relieved that we weren't born in ancient Egypt. Good night, and if you've made it this far, congratulations on resisting the historical sleep aid. Try not to dream of vengeful pharaohs demanding you build them an extra pyramid. Or worse, inviting you to a family reunion. If you've managed to stay awake through this monumental exercise in historical cynicism, consider yourself a true connoisseur of the obscure and the absurd. If you're still breathing and haven't yet sworn off ancient history forever, you might even consider subscribing. Or don't. History doesn't care, and neither, frankly, do I. Sleep well.